Hello, good morning. Thank you so much. And thank you, Amy, for that kind introduction. If any of you were intrigued by that and want to buy one of my books, I think Amy did buy them all in DC this week, but I'm told they'll restock by Monday. So I'm here because I wrote a story about the future. I wrote a story about a world about 60 years from now. In this future that I imagined and designed, the nation state is mostly dead. Not entirely. We get to that in the second book. But mostly it has been replaced by a new global system that I call micro-democracy. This system is based around a jurisdictional unit of 100,000 people called a Centenal. Each of these units, which because they're based on population could be a couple of really dense city blocks or vast tracts of rural land, each of them can vote for any government it wants out of all the governments that exist in the world. So what that means is you could be walking down a city street and over the course of a couple of blocks you could change governments. You could change the country that you're in several times. And conversely, if you're a government, you could have constituents all over the world, scattered in these sentinels. Some governments are quite small and focused on local issues, but many of them have global aspirations and they aim to have sentinels all over the world. And all of this is facilitated by this giant global bureaucracy dedicated to information management, which I called quite creatively when I came up with the first book, information. So this is a kind of UN Google hybrid, love child. And it exists in the world really to collect all the information that there is available and also to get it out to everybody. So this is not a sequestering of information. This is not a big brother. This is we want to make sure everyone has access to all the knowledge they need to participate fully in this system, to the point of actually pushing information into people's faces, annotating speeches of politicians, or annotating commercial advertising that doesn't seem to be quite on the level, making sure that there are no football games playing during important election debates, and so on, really trying to get that information out there. And there's a lot of information available in this future world. There are cameras almost everywhere outside of private buildings that are constantly filming. And all of those feeds, all of those video feeds are available to anybody who wants to look at them at any time, as is all search information. Anything anyone has done on the internet is available, and you can look it up yourself about anyone else at any point in time. I was really surprised when the book came out and people thought it was a dystopia. I don't know. I didn't expect that. But a lot of people read it and found it to be frightening, scary. And I was surprised because that angle, the surveillance part of it, was not what was interesting to me when I was writing. I was writing about the government system. I was writing about information management. The surveillance part was just an extrapolation of what's going on now. It wasn't the change that I wanted people to be paying attention to. It was a very conservative estimate of where we might get to in 60 years from where we are now. Very conservative because really we're not that far off from it. On my short walk to the metro today to get here, I counted 7 cameras, and I'm sure I missed a lot. And that was before I got into the metro station, which was of course entirely cameraed, and before I got off in the downtown where there was at least 1 camera at every intersection. And of course we all know that our search histories return to us in the form of advertising, usually for things that we've either already bought or have no interest in. So we're not actually that far away from the world that I describe in terms of the surveillance, in terms of the amount of information that's available. But there is a difference, and this is the other reason that I was very surprised people took it as a dystopia. There's a difference in how that information is used. In the world I describe, information, this large, massive, supranational organization that controls all information in the world, it's very aware of the fact that it's in a somewhat scary position, that it sounds kind of terrifying. It's also very aware of the fact that there's no such thing as neutrality, that there's no such thing as fair, and that even if there were, the people who work for this organization cannot aspire to that. They can't actually reach fairness or neutrality. There's no way for a human being, let alone an organization, to be completely fair about everything. And so the value that they attempt to replace those is transparency. And instead of trying to balance all the data in some fair way, they try to make all the data as transparent as possible. This is where we got this data, this is the study, here are the numbers, here's a different visualization of it, here's a way to read it if maybe you have a lower reading level, here is it in video explanation. They try to get as much transparency as possible into all their decisions, their underlying structure, and the data that they put forward. And people still found it quite scary to have the idea of this one organization holding all the data, which I think is quite fair. And a lot of the trilogy that I wrote is grappling with that tension. But if you look at the situation today and the way that the data is being used, the cameras that I saw walking here belong to different companies. Possibly the real estate company that owned those properties, possibly the renters. There were probably a couple of public cameras as well, certainly in the metro. Those are all fragmented pieces of information that are being held under different regimes by different entities and being used in different ways. And I don't know anything about how they're being used. I don't know if those cameras were on. I don't know if they were on but not recording. I don't know what can be done with those images of me after today. And so I think a lot of people found it scary to have the idea that anybody could look up all that data that's available, and found that more terrifying than the idea that because I can't look it up, it's easy to forget about, but somebody has control of that data out there, and I don't know how. So though I think that there's some discrepancy here about the degree of terror, I realized that I had in fact hit a nerve. My editor likes to point out that in Infomocracy, the word privacy never gets mentioned, which was unintentional, except to the point that I did think that the people living in that world would be just as used to it as we are living in this world. But once I saw this getting brought up as a concern in a lot of reviews in a lot of places, once my editor started talking about the fact that the word privacy wasn't in there. In the second book, I made sure that the word was mentioned. In fact, I invented a whole government called Privacy Equals Freedom to challenge this state of things a little bit. It's a very small government. Not many people join it. The reactions to it that people living in the surveilled world have, I just channel from the reactions people have when I tell them I don't own a smartphone. It's the kind of, how do you manage? How do you get along? How do you do things? Are you sure it's safe? But what I wanted to explore with that, besides the fact that the surveillance part wasn't actually necessary to any of the other pieces that I found interesting, the information management and the micro-democracy, I also wanted to make sure that I was pointing out the way that privacy is relative and socially constructed. So we know that privacy is a very different concept in different places. You can go somewhere and it's perfectly acceptable for your taxi driver or your coworker to ask you how much you make or tell you that you should really hurry up and have kids. And then there are other places, of course, where that's completely unacceptable. We know that there are places where what parts of your body you show is acceptable or not acceptable, and that varies. We know some places it's fine to breastfeed publicly on a train, and in other places it'll get you kicked out of a cafe. So we know that privacy changes a lot depending on where you are. And while I want to make sure that I don't sound like I'm coming out in favor of this massive surveillance, because I'm not, I don't own a smartphone, I do want to make sure that we're privacy, not necessarily in terms of the specific piece of information being private or not private, but thinking about who controls that piece of information, who owns it, and what they're allowed to do with it. And with that, I just want to tell you that I I have to admit that I lied a little bit again this presentation, because I did not actually write a story about the future. It's impossible. Nobody knows what the future is going to be. You can't write about it. I wrote a story about today. And that's what I'd ask you to think about. So I'm going to pause there to take questions, if anyone has any. And I think we have a microphone going around if anyone has anything to ask. There's one over there. Okay, you found one.
Hi, have you answered the question of who owns the data?
In my book or in reality? So in my book...
In reality, okay.
I'll start with my imagination and compare it to the real world. In my book, information is considered a public good. So both the information infrastructure that is managed by this supranational international organization and the information itself is considered a public good that's publicly available. There is some privacy. As I mentioned, there are no cameras within private buildings, so homes or businesses. And of course also people figure out workarounds. I didn't mention, and I tried to do this when I talk about my book because it sounds extremely wonky and political, but it is a thriller. There are chase scenes, there are katana fights, there are flamethrowers. It's very exciting. There are elections. Elections are exciting. So there's a lot of stuff that goes on as people try to figure out how to get around this pervasive information. And one of the games in it is information surfeit as opposed to information scarcity and how that can be used by, for example, spy assassins. But the ownership, it's a very public idea about information. Now, in this world, of course, we are seeing surveillance capitalism, right? We're seeing that our data is being owned in a very fragmented way by different companies that are able to take it with our acceptance of terms of use. It belongs to them. We don't know exactly what the data is that we're giving them most of the time. We can guess at it, but we don't know because we are not computers collecting every keystroke. We don't know exactly how they're going to use it, or if they have used it, if they're bundling it, or if they're using it individually, if they're anonymizing it effectively or not. So I find that much more scary. I should say too, I'm not necessarily proposing, I wrote the book as a thought experiment rather than a kind of utopia that I'm proposing should happen. But I do think that it's really worth contrasting the idea of a much more public data management regime with this very fragmented, very corporate, and very capitalist one that we're facing right now. Does that answer your question? Thanks.
Hi, so I have Infomocracy on my desk at home on the list of books I'm dying to read but haven't read yet, so I apologize.
I hope I haven't changed your mind.
No, it's gonna go way up to the top of the pile.
Awesome.
So about 20 years ago, David Brin wrote a book called The Transparent Society, making arguments for why radical transparency was better than having lots of privatized data hoards of various things. I'm curious if you've had a chance to look at that and whether you're inspired by it or think it's wrong, or if you have any reaction to that sort of earlier try to imagine that kind of transparent world.
I actually haven't read it, so I can't say too much to that. But I do think that we're seeing reactions to this this kind of sequestering of our data to the degree to which, and I think also there's our data being taken like that. There's also a sense, I think, of the way that a lot of the processes we deal with are being made intentionally more complex and hard to understand. And there's an intentional lack of transparency in a lot of the things that we're dealing with. In my book, I'm primarily concerned with democracy and the question of whether it is possible for democracy to function as intended or as we want it to in a world in which we don't have full information. And the title of the book is fairly clear. Whoever holds the data is able to rule. And so that's the question. But I think, as we're mentioning, we're facing it in a lot of other arenas as well. We're facing it as we make decisions about what we buy or the kind of services that we get or how we protect ourselves, how we try to stay safe. These are all decisions that we need a lot more transparency on. Any other questions?
I'm going to take host's privilege.
Go for it.
Because I actually loved that, even the book doesn't, but if you look at the book reviews for Infomocracy, you won't see the word privacy anywhere. In fact, I tried to pull out a quote from a review and couldn't for this event. But the themes of the people who work on privacy are all over the place. And one of them that I want to pull out is you have these two characters. One is a taxi driver who is fairly unsophisticated about the environment she's operating in. And the other one works at information and knows very much about what is going on. And the level of privacy that they each have access to or can give themselves access to is quite apparently different. Mm-hmm. And so if you could just tease out some of the ideas that went behind that, because you don't confront them explicitly, but they're all through the book in ways that I found very, I wanted to soak up as much of that as I could.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point to bring out as well, is that in this world where we see that our data is getting sold, it's something to other people, and even in the world everyone, and therefore has no value as a commodity to be bought and sold. Privacy is still something that is a privilege and is something that is much more accessible to the people who have, if not money, then certainly access. And so figuring out how to, one of the ways that the character who works for information is able to get more privacy in her life is not so much because she's particularly wealthy or privileged. She's able to see, she has access to know where, how those paths might go, what people are interested in, where the cameras are, and she pays attention to that, and she's able to maneuver that into a way to get much more privacy for herself. Relatedly, I was on an interview with someone who clearly thought the book was a dystopia and was mentioning how he had been in Europe and he had been in a taxi cab and there was a camera in the back of the taxi cab. I'd taken the bus, I would have been on camera the entire time I came here. But you also have to think of it from the taxi driver's perspective. You know, we tend to think of the whole closed-circuit TV, the televising of our lives, as not really making us safer to the extent that is promised, and that being sort of a shill as a way of getting our data and having cases like a taxi driver. You can see how that could have a very concrete effect on how the taxi driver might feel in terms of safety. And so I think that's also when I do have in the second book this person who lives in a government that doesn't have the cameras, the other people think, you know, how do you adjudicate things when there's a dispute? How do you deal with four-way stop crossings or sharp turns that you can't see around? How do you manage a world in which you can't see what's going on and can't go back and see what happened? So it's important to keep that part in mind too.
Hi, thank you for explaining the book. I'm definitely interested in reading it now. I wanted to go to the point you just made about privacy as a privilege and kind of bring it back to your other work as a humanitarian aid worker. How do you see the use of tech? I hear a lot about using technology, throwing tech and gathering data and AI for tracking refugee flows, improving the lives of refugees, et cetera, et cetera. And then the actual knowledge of how that data is gathered, stored, used, and the benefits of it that those affected populations actually, whether they actually understand fully the implications, and if you have any experience with that in your other field.
Thank you. That's a really great question. And I think it goes back to the crux of what I was saying, which is, you know, there's not necessarily anything particularly wrong, scandalous, dangerous about one person noting down their name and where they're from. But when we know that there's a power imbalance, when we know that the people who are taking that information have ways of keeping it and tracking it, that the people giving the information don't understand and are not able to access, certainly on any regular basis, then it becomes very dangerous, very scary. So, and I've actually heard recently of some of the companies that have been implicated in the recent elections and the Brexit referendum being involved in programs with the World Food Program and others of registering people who are crossing borders. And I think it's extremely problematic and scary. That said, I think that collection of data to try to improve programs is very important. You know, I'm someone who very much believes in monitoring and evaluating what we do, and to do that you need data. You need to be tracking things. But the ways, again, who owns it, the ways in which it is collected, the ways in which it is explained to the people it's collected from, the ways in which it's, I don't even think that anonymizing is helpful in this, although it's certainly, you know, it's a minimum maybe start. But to make sure that the power imbalance isn't there, to make sure that the tech isn't entirely on one side away from the people whose data it is a very, very important factor. So thank you for asking. Okay, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to call it, but I think if there are no other questions, it's probably lunchtime. Thank you so much for your attention, and I will be around for a little bit if anyone does have questions in the meantime. Thank you.